Donald Trump is now elected to be President of the United States. What are his likely economic policies? This indeed is a little tricky to work out, because if you have a candidate who comes out with the most extraordinary rhetoric, often self-contradictory and often untrue, so with this post-truth, postmodern politics, it is a little tricky. But here goes. Here's an attempt to look dispassionately at Donald Trump's economic policies. Well, basically what we're going to look at is the likely macroeconomic effect on the USA and the world. What's the effect on growth, inflation, unemployment, share prices indeed, and the exchange rate, the level of the dollar? Well, on this side, we've got all the positive aspects, the things that will boost growth basically, and on this side we have the negative aspects of his policies, the negative policies, which will tend to reduce growth and are quite alarming potentially. Well, let's just make the key point. Number one, it depends really what he can get through Congress. So certain measures, anything to do with fiscal policy, tax and spend, he has to get through Congress. Other issues to do with regulation, he can issue presidential decrees, which will override the decrees of President Obama. He can just rip up the presidential orders of Obama, particularly in the areas of regulation and climate change. To an extent, on trade and immigration, the president has more leeway. If you form a new trade agreement, it has to have the agreement of Congress, but to scrap an agreement, that can be done by presidential decree. Okay, so let's have a look. First of all, on taxation, we can see extraordinary tax cuts. So corporation tax will be cut from 35 to 15%, from amongst the highest in the Western world to amongst the lowest in the Western world. Income tax, the top level for the rich, is likely to be cut from 39.6 to 33%. Estate taxes are going to be eliminated on large estates. The effect of this, of course, is highly regressive, so that the rich will become richer and very little will accrue to the poor, depending upon what happens in the House of Congress and what he gets through. Okay. It's very likely that companies will have huge benefits, their profitability will increase, and therefore there might be some investment, of course reinvestment of those profits in the US economy. There'll be an increase in foreign direct investment into the US economy, and of course this is why US share prices have increased. Okay, so if you look at S&P 500, it's done quite well since the election, and that's based on the premise that net profits will increase, dividends will increase, and therefore share values increase. And then we move on to the area of government expenditure infrastructure. Oh, by the way, the tax reductions are estimated to cost about 4 to 5 trillion over 10 years, if carried out over 10 years. So this is a huge injection of spending into the US economy. On government expenditure and infrastructure, again, it's estimated to be about 1 trillion what he intends to spend on huge infrastructure projects that we haven't perhaps seen since the Roosevelt era. It would warm the Keynesian heart to a great extent. So, as Donald Trump says, he's going to build beautiful roads, beautiful railways, beautiful bridges, beautiful tunnels, etc., right across the United States. This he may fund with a national investment bank issuing bonds. And of course, even if you are a left-wing Labour supporter in the UK, you might think, gosh, this is a refreshing idea. Many economists, particularly Keynesian economists, have been arguing for such an infrastructure boost to the UK economy as well as the US economy. And part of the reason for that is that although the US is third in terms of competitiveness in the world, according to the World Economic Forum, it's 24th in terms of the quality of its infrastructure. That's a bit like the British story, really. So the benefits of that, well, there would be a boost to jobs, there would be a boost to productivity, there would be a boost to competitiveness, but also a huge increase in the national debt. Okay? So the national debt is likely to increase. It's 80% at the moment of GDP, the US national debt, increasing every moment. And by 2025, it's likely to be 105% of GDP if we continue with the tax and government expenditure policies as laid out by Donald Trump, if he can get those through Congress. Again, you need Congress to support tax and spending changes. And this brings us on to deregulation. Now, this is of great concern to environmentalists, but as Obama couldn't get environmental regulations through the Senate or Congress, then he introduced a deregulation by presidential decree. Well, of course, Trump can just rip those up. Okay, and it's likely that there'll be some form of deregulation. Well, ignoring the environment, which is not a great thing to do, but just doing that is likely to reduce business costs and then therefore benefit profitability and should result in some short-term economic growth. Because on climate change, Trump rejects the notion of climate change. However, at a federal level across the United States, such as California, take climate change seriously. So it's not exactly clear the overall balance of what will happen there between a presidential level and a federal level. And then this brings us to a really serious issue, which is what happens to trade. Trump talked a lot about trade, about making America great again, and about bringing jobs back for US manufacturing, particularly in the so-called Rust Belt, which has suffered from deindustrialization. What he said is that the North Atlantic Free Trade Area, NAFTA, which has been formed since '94, including US, Canada and Mexico, this area is either going to leave, which would be very disturbing and certainly revolutionary and potentially catastrophic, but most likely he'll renegotiate a deal with Mexico and Canada, and Congress, of course, would have to ratify that new trade deal. There's a danger that he might leave the WTO. He's made very critical comments about the World Trade Organization, and of course this is one of the great Washington consensus liberal institutions of the world to promote free trade. It's important to reflect that there's been a quicker growth in free trade than economic growth. In other words, trade has helped economies grow in the world, particularly, of course, China, in the last few decades particularly. And therefore, if trade slows, it'll slow economic growth, causing unemployment, etc. And it will come back to that. The Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. This is formed of 12 countries in the Far East, including the US. This is formed of the EU and US. Well, they've got problems in any case, but he's just going to stop those. Okay, so those won't develop. Now, the most alarming thing that he's said is perhaps to do with tariffs. So he's threatened China, Mexico to an extent, but China with 45% tariffs on imports. Now, the US hasn't done this since the Hoover days of the 30s, which prolonged significantly the Great Depression of the 1930s. Is this going to happen again? Because if you introduce tariffs against Chinese imports, well, how's China going to respond? It's going to retaliate with tariffs they're going to retaliate with tariffs of their own. So basically you could end up, in a worst case scenario, with a rather unfortunate trade war, with higher and higher tariffs really stymieing the growth in world trade. And this would have a catastrophic effect on economic growth, both on world economic growth and on growth in the US. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research in London predicted if you implement these policies, which come from the rhetoric and indeed the website of Trump, then you'd get 0% growth for 2 years or so after their implementation, and then obviously slow growth from then on. If you introduce these policies, imports are going to become much more expensive, and therefore the standard of living would fall for many workers, for the US economy. And indeed, the anti-globalisation and anti-trade rhetoric is at odds with the reality, because most people, in fact 80 to 90% of the jobs lost in manufacturing in the US, according to most academic studies, or all academic studies really, are displacement as a result of new technology. So they're what we call structural unemployment in the language of economics, because these workers have the wrong skills and they're in the wrong place, and they've been replaced by technology. So if we make cars, we obviously have automation and use robots rather than people. So really you need a big retraining to solve the problem. Those manufacturing jobs as well aren't easily going to come back. So this is very serious. We'll come back to that. Immigration, of course, is another area that very much concerns many voters and many in the West. He's backtracked then from the 11 million illegal migrants that he was going to repatriate, and it looks like it's going to be 2 or 3 million migrants. Well, that wouldn't have a significant economic effect. And of course it looks like the wall is going to become a fence between the US and Mexico. In any case, the wall would need congressional support because it involves a fiscal outlay. So on immigration, if we were to implement these policies, then it will tend to cause a skills gap. If there's a curb on immigration, then that will restrict the growth of the labour force, and the supply of key skills will become a shortage area. And of course this is what's holding back the shares of technical stocks based often in California, because they won't be able to recruit the skilled labour force. Same of course with universities. That is a danger. Okay. And then we come to monetary policy. Well, if we've got a loosening of fiscal policy, it's very likely that there'll be a tightening of monetary policy, because inflation is likely to increase. Therefore, the Federal Reserve, Central Bank of the USA, is likely sooner rather than later to increase interest rates. And clearly, Donald Trump doesn't like quantitative easing, and it's likely that quantitative easing will come to an end. It will in any case, because if inflation is beginning to rise. The reason why inflation will rise is because there's more demand from tax cuts and government expenditure. Just one point on tax cuts: if you do cut for the rich, they have less of what we call a multiplier effect, because the rich tend to save rather than spend. If you have tax cuts on the poor, they'll tend to spend, because the poor have a much higher marginal propensity to save. So the tax cuts won't all be passed on, and won't have such a great multiplier effect, because it looks like they will be largely for the rich. Another thing that's happened very recently is that share prices have gone up and bond prices have fallen, because if you're going to supply a huge number of bonds, you've increased the supply of US bonds, and therefore their price will fall and bond yields will increase. This increases short-term interest rates across the world. It's worth bearing in mind that the US economy is the #1 economy in the world. China is the #2 economy in the world. Therefore, it's very much in the interest of the world and world growth that both countries actually get on and negotiate their imbalances. So this brings us to what is he likely to do? Well, his friends and people around him say he's very pragmatic and not ideological. He's used to cutting business deals, and it very much depends on the people around him what may happen. I tend to think optimistically, some may say naively, that the realpolitik will come across. He'll have to work with the Republicans in the Congress, and events matter, as Harold Macmillan said. If he starts to implement some of these dodgier trade ideas, such as leaving the World Trade Organization or leaving NAFTA, it's likely that share prices will fall significantly, the currency will fall, and he'll backtrack from that. We've already seen a lot of backtracking. There's a lot more to be seen. So it's likely that he'll pursue 1, 2, and possibly 3 to a greater extent than the trade restrictions and immigration curbs. Let's hope this is all hot air. And therefore, what's extraordinary is that you have a president who, in the form of Donald Trump, who might actually implement some left-wing, Labour, Keynesian-type policies in terms of a huge increase in government expenditure. And it's likely, therefore, if we have an expansionary fiscal policy, that economic growth will increase, inflation will increase to some extent, but at low levels that's not necessarily a problem, unemployment may fall. But it's worth bearing in mind that at 4.9%, the US is close to full employment. And so there's less room for cutting unemployment than might be thought, and therefore if you're close to full employment, inflation is more likely to rise. Share prices have already gone up and the dollar may well remain strong. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this.